Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. On today's agenda we'll be taking a look at the very special German Major Bayern 2024 event held on the weekend of September 14th to 15th of this year. Now, why is this event so important? Of course, because it is one of the only two events the Leagues of Votann have won this season of Pariah Nexus, so pretty impactful. But before we go any further, I want to give a quick shout out to our channel members Jordan Stuckenschneider, Saturn ASMR, The Pulp, Fusel, Sam P, Thomas Missior, and Austri TM. Thank you guys so much for your ongoing support to the channel. It really does mean a lot. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about becoming a channel member, I have a link for you down in the description below. So on today's agenda, as always, we'll take a look at the Votann placings, do a quick deep dive on the list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and of course contextualize the results of the placings by looking at a couple of the matchups. So this event, the list was piloted by Mathieu Clerc, who came first place out of 105 players, taking home a 6-win, 0-draw, 0-loss placing. Matchups included Votann 20-0 against Salamanders, Votann 20-0 against Necrons, Votann 20-0 against Blood Angels, a victory of 13-7 against CSM Raiders, a very tight score game of 11-9 against Adepta Soraa, and then wrapping the event up, we have Game 6, a 16-point victory to Raiders at 4. This is of course using the WTC scoring. Now, as for the list itself, we have something I would consider extremely unique for a design. And there are a couple reasons for that we'll discuss in a moment. So, kicking things off, we have two characters, an Ioneer champion with Appraising Glare enhancement, and a Cal running Grim Demeanor. Grim Demeanor has kind of fallen out of flavor this season, but in this case, we do see an inclusion in the list, and of course, it's attached to the Hammer unit being a 10-man brick of Ioneer Hearthguard. And these Hearthguard are running Plasmas. So, I think in this situation here, Plasmas, in my opinion, aren't that great. I would much rather have Vulcanites, and I do tend to prefer having smaller squads of Hearthguard coming out of Land Fortresses or even just a 5-man in Deep Strike. But I do see the value in having Grim Demeanor paired with the Hearthguard having Plasmas specifically, because it does mean that you're able to guarantee effectively that you get the most amount of value out of each single shot of Plasma that you have, because you do only get one shot. So you effectively get to negate things like Armor of Contempt that would reduce the AP of your weapon, or something that would reduce the damage characteristic of the weapon as well. So I think in this case it's a very solid pairing. For a few points more, you get to basically reliably guarantee that your hammer unit gets to keep hammering. Of course, it also does contribute to movement, contribute to charges and things like that, just helping to ensure that you, once again, just deliver whatever kind of punishment you're trying to actually do with the unit and help ensure that all your damage goes through. So I don't think this is a bad choice by any means, but this is probably the only context I would expect to see Grim Demeanor played in to this capacity, is if you are running a large 10-man brick. For the Ioneer champion who has Appraising Glare, this appears to be run solo, and this no longer takes me by surprise because I myself have been running the Ioneer champion solo to great success. I think he's a solid piece to have in the list. A lot of good utility. He's able to run up and do sabotage somewhere very tightly without having to expose himself to any firing or any angles. He helps screen your backfield as well. And of course, with the mass hammer, if something does get too close, he can push up and try to pressure that a little bit more aggressively. It also basically guarantees, unless your opponent has a lot of like 3-inch deep strikes or something, that you're going to reliably get Appraising Glare out every turn without needing to worry about this character dying. So a very cheap action monkey, very durable, and just a lot of good utility and force multiplying for your army without necessarily needing to actually be a part of the fight. Next up, we have the first interesting choice here, and this is a single 10-man brick of Hearthkin Warrior. Now, in my experience, I tend to prefer running 2 squads of 10. This is how I would start any list off with. I wouldn't really feel comfortable running fewer than this because I do think that the Warriors provide a lot of good innate utility. They effectively act as 2 activations for the price of 1, so you're buying 1 unit at 100 points, and then you're able to separate them by combat squatting and just get more bodies on the table to do more things. They're also pretty useful for screening against certain armies like World Eaters, for example, in case you don't want to have like too thin of a line around some of your more important units like tanks, and it also allows you to start threatening objectives early on with some kind of pressure that your opponent has to commit to trading against in order to get you off of the objective. So I do quite like the Hearthken Warriors, and I typically would run 2 squads of 10. So the sacrifice here of only taking 1 squad of 10 does free up more points for other things, as we'll see in just a moment, but it is a little bit risky, and we'll assess this a little later when we look at the weaknesses. So the second choice here that caught my eye is the inclusion of 2 squads of 10 Jaegers. Now this is quite rare to see, because a lot of people have not actually gotten to see any boxes of Jaegers at all in the store. So with 2 of them being here, this is pretty surprising, I think, because not a lot of people have experience playing against a double or even triple Jaeger bomb list at events. This means that there is some kind of element of surprise to facing a list like this, because you aren't entirely comfortable with Votann maybe having such a large midboard presence so early on in the game right out of the gate. It also means that you could be a little bit more aggressive with your Jaegers if you want to be, so you can have some that are maybe deployed to screen out, you could have some that are securing an expansion objective, and then you can use like your second squad to push up forward and try to move block. So I think that they do provide a ton of utility. It's only 80 points, and you do get a squad of 10 bodies to throw up the board. They have a reactive move, so it could be really, really annoying. And they're pretty decent early skirmishers, which is complementary, of course, to the loadout that this player has opted to select. So here we have a set of 9 pistols and knives with the inclusion of a single APM launcher, disregarding the sniper rifle. So we're not taking a sniper here, and I actually do think that this is probably the better choice. The sniper in my games has served zero purpose. It's a single shot, doesn't really do all that much, but having the extra set of knives might actually be impactful when you're engaging in other skirmishing units in combat. So I do understand the choice here of omitting that, and instead just running 9 sets of pistols and knives with the APM launcher. So pretty solid choice here. We have 2 of them. 1 set is great, 2 is even stronger. We typically would only expect to see this if we're running a lot of Sagittars, but in this list we're only running 2, which leads me to believe that we're really going for that utility with this, in the sense of rather than securing the center of the table or denying your opponent's ability to deny your scout moves, we're actually really using these guys super aggressively here to just bog things down, move block, and just buy you some time on primary and the board state. Moving on to the third interesting choice that caught my eye as well here, we have 2 squads of Berserks, 1 single 10-man brick equipped with mauls and 2 grenade launchers. Now this is quite rare. I don't believe we've seen this ran before since early Leviathan days, if I'm not mistaken, inside of one of the party bus lists we reviewed. So in this case, we have a 10-man brick. These guys are going to ride inside of one of the 2 land fortresses in this list, and it effectively acts as a second or primary hammer. So this might be your first trading piece that comes out and just decimates an objective, and then your Hearthguard can either come down the following turn to reinforce, or you can use them somewhere else on the table, which is quite useful, because this is typically one of the things we see with Votann, is that when you do commit to being somewhere, you're kind of stuck there afterwards. So you want to make sure that with your 5-inch movement, you're landing somewhere that you want to be in. You need to be doing something effective in that spot. And so with a 10-man brick of Hearthguard especially, you will land, you will delete whatever you're shooting and then charging and killing. But once you do that, you're stuck there. So I think that this gives you a little bit more flexibility with the Berserks. Coming out of a land fortress, they effectively get an 8-inch movement, and then you have the 12-inch charge distance. So you do have a 20-inch threat range, which is quite far and pretty nice. And most importantly, it gives you a pretty cheap trading piece at just 200 points, which can reliably pick up quite a lot of profiles in the game. Especially when you consider comboing it with our stratagems for Warrior's Pride to increase your AP if something does have judgment tokens on it. The other set of Berserks is more of a tech piece, I think, and what we're looking at here is a 5-man squad with axes. We don't usually see axes, but I do know that one of the players we interviewed, Jordan Stuckenschneider, had mentioned that he did find that they were quite useful into Marine matchups. And I do think we see this come into play when we look at some of the matches that this player faced, 2 of which were Space Marines. So I think that there is some value in having the Berserk squad with axes. It does a little bit more reliably kill Marine bodies because you base hit on 3s instead of 4s compared to the hammers, which means that if you have 2 tokens, you're going to be hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s for Marines. So again, quite powerful. You also have the sweep profile flexibly, which means if you're facing like a horde unit or like a horde list, you have a little bit more play as well, which might actually come up when we look at some of these matchups here, being CSM and the ACDCs. Which, funny enough, I actually think is a meta menace, but Votann do have the tools to deal with them pretty effectively. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. You can, of course, also use these guys pretty effectively for secondary actions as well. Next up is the 10-man Hearthguard brick with the plasma. So, of course, our Hesir has the Concussion Hammer, which is statistically the best weapon choice. They're running the Teleport Crest, and then the rest of them have Gauntlets and, of course, the Plasma Gun. I think the Plasma Gun, like I said earlier, is a little bit underwhelming in my opinion, just being a single shot, meaning that without access to any rerolls, it makes things a little bit swingy. But I do appreciate the inclusion of Grim Demeanor here just to help amplify some of that damage and make it a little bit more reliable. So this is a sound choice. It is also 10 bodies of Terminators that are landing on the board somewhere, shooting and charging into something, which again is quite powerful, as many of us know. It acts as a hammer and pseudo anvil, being at -1 to be wounded, and of course with the cowl being attached, if the unit does survive a couple of turns, you will get some added value of just popping out extra judgment tokens for free through the cowl's native ability. Next, we have 3 squads of 3 pioneers. These are your secondary pieces. These guys are going to be screening your backfield, especially when we consider that there are fewer units that will be sitting in the backfield, as there are less warriors included in this list. This means that we don't have to feel as bad about sending these warriors out a little bit more aggressively to either compete with trade wars or to try to score us something, as the bikes can pretty securely cover the entire rear end. It also means later in the game these guys could go up and down, and with 3x3 you should be able to have some alive to do some sneaky things, like get angles on units that are just left over with a couple models remaining, a couple wounds, or being able to push up and try to score some kind of objective like behind enemy lines or stealing your opponent's backfield home objective. Next up, we have 2 Heka Chonker land fortresses. I love these guys. I run 3, so it's nice to see 2 of them in this list still, because I think that they're solid. They're really tough bodies. They're tough to shift. They do a decent amount of damage. They're damage 4 on their main gun, which is really powerful. Damage 2 on all the other ones. So this thing is quite effective into 4 wound models and 4 wound units, which is pretty good. It also gives you some pretty decent anti-tank if you're shooting at something that's double judged. Most of the time you'll be wounding these things on 4s, sometimes even 3s. If you have access to cover and you're taking return fire and you pop void armor as well, usually you'll be saving at most on a 4-up save. So quite durable, good for primary, good for clearing objectives, good for getting on them. And then last but not least, we have the inclusion of just 2 little baby Sagittars. These, of course, will likely be transporting the Hearthkin Warrior that is split, and potentially the Berserk squad as well, if the player chooses to not start his 5 warriors on a home objective instead. This means you have a little bit more flexibility, as you could play the flanks with one of your trading pieces like the Berserks, or if the matchup requires it, you could have them start in one of the land fortresses that'll play a little bit more central. The weapons of choice on these Sagittars are, of course, the Hylas. I think the Hylas is probably the better weapon. It's just that threat of potentially spiking with damage that keeps your opponent a little bit more honest. And of course, against most vehicles or monsters, double judged, these things are going to be wounding on 2s, with the potential, of course, to dish out a ton of damage if you spike. So that's the list. Very interesting. A lot of big units. It's quite elite, coming in at just 15 activations. But I think it does have a lot of play, as we see here with the player's phenomenal placing. So in terms of strengths, I think the list has really good staying power. We're running a lot of big, durable bricks, a lot of bodies, larger units, which means natively they have to take a lot more firepower to bring down. A lot of these things are quite tough, as we mentioned with the land fortresses, with the Hearthguard squads. Whenever these things come down, they land somewhere, it's going to take a dedicated amount of fire from your opponent's list to take them down, meaning that you have very good staying power on objectives. Quite nice. I think the list also has some pretty good secondary play, considering that it is so elite. We factored in the fact that we're going to be committing a lot of points to primary here with some of these bigger trading pieces, and so as a result of that, we've brought in more of the bikes, 3x3 bikes, allowing us to have more support. We also have 2x10 Jaegers, which means we get to either play secondaries with these guys as well, by keeping them inside of a ruin, maybe getting us engaged on all fronts, or eventually behind enemy lines if we have to. But Undoubtedly, these guys will die probably pretty early on, and they are here to slow the game down to get it to a point where, because you have fewer trading pieces, you don't need to start committing them until your opponent does later in the game, and you are better poised to pick them up. I think another good advantage to this list is the built-in redundancies. There's a lot of 2 of everything. I'm a big fan of that. It means that you basically double down on a play, and you help guarantee that you're not just relying on one unit to get lucky. You have this added redundancy. You have this added support. You can commit 2 things to do the same job and know that you have a better chance of getting it done. It also means that if your opponent decides to focus fire and kill one thing, you have a second one that either is identical or plays a similar role that is waiting to strike next. It helps better leverage some of those trading capabilities. Another good strength is that it's a pretty unique build. It's not something I've seen before, and I think that a lot of opponents probably aren't used to playing against something like this when they think of Votann, which could probably catch them off guard. And then lastly here, I put that there's good utility. We have 2 squads of 10 Jaegers. This means you have good move blocking potential, reactive move. You could set yourself up to do whatever you need to do at the start of the game. And we also have the single Iron Champion with Appraising Glare, which is a pretty nice tech piece that I love including in my lists. Now that said, I do think that there are some weaknesses. I think that there's, just by the nature of the list and nature of the design, there are fewer activations, which means it's going to be a little bit tougher for us to win trading wars. There's reduced objective trading is what I wrote here. And of course by that I mean, if let's say you're playing with an opponent who's trying to just slowly bait out your units, they probably will have around 17 or 18 activations in their list to your 15, which means that by extension you'll have to commit more things earlier on, or you'll run out of things before they do. So this could force fights, and hopefully you have the firepower and damage to be able to actually have favorable trades when you have to commit something bigger early on. Another weakness I identified is that by excluding the other warrior squad, we do have weaker screening potential. Yes, the bikes could screen in the back, but let's say we're playing an army like World Eaters, for example. Against an army like World Eaters, you probably want to have one of those warrior squads starting on the line, and you're just trying to protect one of your tanks. If they go first, they will charge in and kill it. So I think I would feel a little bit uncomfortable walking into a game like this because it does feel like we're trying to avoid potentially certain matchups. Then again, because we have so many Jaegers, we can have the Jaeger double as one of those units, one of those supporting screeners. So instead of forward deploying aggressively, maybe you deploy a little bit more defensively with one of your 10-man bricks just to help better screen your units. I'd be curious to hear the pilot's thoughts on this, and if he felt that in some of his games or in some matchups that he potentially avoided, and if that would have impacted his game negatively. Okay, so next I want to talk real quick about 3 of these matchups. Now this was a 6-game event, so we're just going to focus on 3 of them that I thought were particularly interesting. The first one is going to be Game 2 against Necrons. Now the list that the Necron player was running is the Awaken Dynasty Detachment. I have been seeing this list being played a little bit more frequently, this detachment at least, and the idea here is running very character-heavy lists that provide a lot of buffs to some of your other units. Now in this list we have a ton of characters, a bunch of Technomancers, Locust Lord, Scorpek, and Illuminor Cesraz. We also have 2 Canoptic Reanimators, 3 squads of large Canoptic Wraiths, we have Death Marks, 2 squads of Flayed Ones, and a bunch of Locust Destroyers. Now, in this matchup, I think Votann are favorable, and they have a significant advantage, especially because there's an exclusion of a Catan. There is no Catan in this list, which means it becomes even easier for us to deal with some of the threats present. Let me explain. So at the start of the game, you're going to mark your 3 Wraith squads. Why is that? Because the Wraiths want to do one thing. They want to bog down objectives. They want to get in the way, get on an objective, and be impossible to shift. That is how Necrons play with Wraiths. They want to stop you. That is what they do. Stop you from scoring and score points themselves. Just be annoying to break and annoying to deal with. Thankfully, Votann have the most effective tool against these units. What is that? Grudging. Double token. Start of the game, all of these guys are judged. Great. +1 to hit, +1 to wound. We now have the tools to deal with these more effectively. And we do deal with them quite well. For example, throwing in your big squad of Hearthguard, shooting into everything with your plasmas, shooting into everything with your grenade launchers, and then charging into combat. I do think you will be able to pick up a squad of Wraiths quite reliably. Now, the other thing that's important about this is when we look at the list design, the only damage dealing unit, the only real big threat, are the Locust Destroyers, the big 6-man brick. Now, against our army specifically, yes, it's a ton of shots coming out here, but they aren't all that impactful. They're only AP2, which means if we do have cover and we do have void armor, we're still saving on 2 pluses. This could be really damaging to the Necron player who's committing this unit to try to pick up our Terminator brick, which is probably what he's going to be trying to do, as this is our biggest response to those Wraith units. We can then trade our Berserks into the Locust Destroyer squad, which should reliably pick up the unit. Once we deal with the Wraiths, there isn't really all that much resilience left to the Necron player. This list is banking on having resiliency and durability, something that Votann are good at crushing. The Wraiths want to come to us, perfect, we let them come to us. We played the mid-range game, and then we're able to crush them and secure the objectives. There really isn't that much of a threat in this list towards Votann. There are no Immortals here, which we've sacrificed to have a lot more durability in the list with the extra Wraith squad, and there's no Nightbringer. The Nightbringer is quite scary as well because of his Mortal Wound Blast. But without the Nightbringer being here, it's one less thing we have to commit to killing, which means we can assign one of our set of Judgment Tokens at the start of the game to one of the Flayed One units, which might be positioned a little bit aggressively because these have Infiltrate. That means in response, we can use our Jaegers to move up, charge, and kill these on turn 1, securing us extra command points for the start of turn 2. So all in all, I think Votann have an extremely strong matchup into a list like this, as the biggest strength is banking on durability, something that we're able to crush quite easily when there are only 3 big units for us to choose from. Now, the next game I want to talk about here is a little bit more interesting. This one is going to be Game 4 against Chaos Space Marines Renegade Raiders. And this is running the very infamous Team France WTC list with the ACDCs. What are ACDCs? They are Accursed Cultists and Dark Commune. Essentially, as we'll see here in the list on the side, we are running large squads of Accursed Cultists, which are extremely durable just for the sheer number of wounds and bodies that they bring. They do a ton of damage, a surprisingly high amount of high strength damage as well, which is good into elite units. And they get buffs through their Dark Commune, they get buffs through the Detachment. They're effectively able to reroll hits and wounds on objectives, making this unit of cultists actually significantly powerful. You effectively get 2 bodyguard units within a single unit. You have your mutants, which are defending the torments, and then you have the torments, which are defending the Dark Commune if you attach them. So a lot of redundancy here, a lot of durability. They're hammers, they're anvils, they're fast, they're annoying, they're aggressive. They could do anything you want, and their damage output is amplified in this detachment. We then have some Chaos Predators, a large squad of Chosen, and we've allied in some Rubik Marines for Flamer Overwatch. Now, I think this is a tough list for a lot of armies to face, and with good reason. The Accursed Cultists are the all-stars. They're pretty cheap for what they do. They're very cheap, arguably. But I think for Votann, we once again come to that idea that despite us being just a straight arrow army, we like to kill things. A few things at a time, and we kill them quite well. So you put your tokens on these 3 big bricks of Accursed Cultists. You're now hitting them on 3s or 2s, and you're wounding them on 2s almost always. This, coupled with the sheer volume of shots that you can bring in your list thanks to your Hearthguard squads, means that you pick this up reliably every time you shoot at it. I haven't done the math yet, but I do feel like on average, you do pick up a squad of Accursed Cultists, shooting at them with a huge squad of Hearthguard. This is very impactful because the list lives and dies on its ability to have its Accursed Cultists survive long enough to dominate the board. I think another really key piece here is the inclusion of the 2 Jaeger squads. The 2 Jaeger squads allow you, as we mentioned earlier, to play aggressively and try to move block if you need to. And in this case, I think it could be critical. This would allow you to stop the Accursed Cultists from getting the early advantage on your objectives by blocking them out and blocking access to some of those routes. The Berserks again here are probably quite interesting, as being damage 3, they'll be able to do a significant amount of damage to some of the torments inside of the Accursed Cultist squad. It also means if we use our alternative sweep profile, we could probably pick up the mutant bodyguard unit that is kind of baked into the Accursed Cultist unit itself. As for the large Chosen brick, this is something that once it comes out and is ready to be traded, you could commit your 10-man brick of Berserks to, pop your Warrior's Pride on it, and just get that extra AP to go through, pushing him to effectively 6-up saves or no saves at all. Depending on how many tokens you get on them, of course. But the key thing here is dealing with these Accursed Cultists, which I do think Votann does well. It's still a tough game. It's a tough matchup for sure, I think, for a lot of armies. And this is reflected in the more even score of the game. Okay, the last game I want to talk about are Adepta Soraa. So this was game 5 out of 6. Now, I don't have a ton of experience playing into this army. I played into them once at an event, and I lost because I just didn't really know how to deal with them. And I still think that they're a really powerful army. It's reflected in their stats. It's reflected in the tier lists we see online. They're powerful. They have the tools to do basically anything and do it well. They could completely skew the results of the game just by flipping their dice at whim. What this means is that you're looking at this list at first and you might be inclined to say, okay, what's the big catch? There are a bunch of T3 bodies. They have 1 wound each. This is easy. The problem is that they have access to so many tools, so many ways of increasing the efficiency of their data cards, just ensuring that the highest possible value on a d6 dice with Melta goes through, just ensuring that that critical damage you inflict to their tanks is saved, meaning that they take none and their vehicle survives. It means it requires you to commit more than you would usually have to commit to kill something, and commit more than you would usually have to commit to take return fire and still stay on an objective. This is quite hard to manage, and I think it's amplified by the fact that Votann, again, are a pretty simple army in terms of mechanics and rules, and Adepta Soraa has some of the more funner rule interactions and abilities in the game. So this means that they do kind of have an advantage over us. In terms of trading, I think one of the big disadvantages with the Votann army is that you do have fewer activations. However, I do also think in this matchup, you're kind of looking for just these gigantic threats to help deal with them. There's a lot of Overwatch happening, and having a 10-man brick of Berserks that have 2 wounds each and a feel no pain means that you could probably tank a lot more than you should be able to on these units. I also think that the smaller Berserk squad is probably quite helpful here as well, as when it does connect, if it does use its sweep profile, it's going to be able to pick up a lot of these single wound models pretty reliably. One of the more difficult aspects about this matchup, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of dealing with their vehicles, and I think this is especially true when we consider the Hecaton Land Fortress, which only really has 2 big shots on its main weapon. Of course you could spike, of course you might roll more, but really you're looking at 2 baseline shots on your SP conversion beamer, which means that let's say you get 3 through and then you fail to wound with one, your opponent saves with the other, they might just blank the other one and then suddenly save your vehicle. Or even if you get 2 through, they might blank one on their vehicle and then it survives. So suddenly, when you thought you were going to make an effective trade by exposing one of your units, it was denied. They survived, you're vulnerable, and then you die to the return fire. So I think it's a really tough game. It's a tricky matchup to do well, and I would love to hear how the pilot felt this game went and just learn a little bit more about it. But nonetheless, a very tight game, being just 11-9, almost a draw, meaning that we can only assume that the pilot Matsir did an incredible job piloting his list and navigating the battlefield in this mission. So that's the list and a couple of the key matches I was interested in analyzing. Let me know what you guys think about it down in the description below. I know that it's quite unique. It's something I'd be curious to try out myself. And of course, a massive congratulations again to the pilot of this list, Matsir, for winning us, the Votann community, the fellow kin, a major event for Pariah Nexus. And once again, a huge thank you, of course, to our channel members and for you, the viewer, for tuning in for this week's video. If you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more Votann content. You can also join our Discord server free of charge to talk tactics, strategies, list building, and even get your models featured in my weekly videos. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.